Skeptics like Alex O'Connor say that we can't use the martyrdom of the apostles as evidence for their sincerity because the New Testament only records the deaths of 2 of them. As he puts it,
the rest of every single account of the apostles being martyred for their faith relies solely and fully and entirely on church tradition, which, hey, may give us some reason to think that it was the case, but isn't the most evidential of bases.
And in one sense, Alex is right. Christian apologists do often oversell the argument for martyrdom. The historical record on exactly how each apostle died is pretty spotty. But that's not the real issue here. The point isn't just about how they died. It's about whether they were actually willing to suffer for what they had witnessed. And on that front, I think we have plenty of evidence. Jesus was executed in Jerusalem like a common criminal, a fact even the Roman historian Tacitus confirms. But what happened next is just as important. Despite his death, his followers began spreading his message right there in the city where he was killed. From Jerusalem, Christianity spread through Judea and across the Roman Empire. Tacitus backs this up, noting that after an initial setback, the movement came roaring back and even reached Rome within 30 years, matching what we have in Acts. Now, think about that. Jesus' disciples had just seen their leader brutally executed. Do they really expect to be safe? If anything, they had every reason to lay low, but instead they doubled down right in enemy territory. Secondly, and follow this closely, in every single gospel, Jesus explicitly warns his disciples, the very people who would later preach his resurrection, that they would face intense persecution. These weren't vague statements about general Christian suffering. He was talking directly to the 12. Jesus said things like, they're going to hand you over to be persecuted, even kill some of you, and you'll be hated by everyone because of me. No one who has left home or family for my sake in the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in the present age, along with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. They'll arrest you, drag you into synagogues and prisons, and put you on trial before rulers because of me. Even your own family, parents, siblings, relatives, and friends will betray you, and some of you will be killed. A time is coming when people will think they're serving God by killing you. They'll do this because they don't really know the Father or me. But I'm telling you this now, so when it happens, you remember that I warned you. Now, I'm not saying that just because these verses exist, we can automatically assume that Jesus actually predicted these events and that they came true. That would just be assuming Christianity is true from the get-go. But here's what we can safely say. Either number one, Jesus really did say these things, and history played out exactly as he predicted, or number two, the gospel writers put these words into his mouth after the events had already happened. Either way, the disciples were persecuted. The only other alternatives are pretty far-fetched. Either Jesus scared his followers for no reason, making up a threat that didn't exist, or Jesus never said any of this, and the gospel writers who lived after these events completely fabricated his prophecy, even though history would have proven them wrong. Given those options, the first two are the only ones that make any sense. And if Jesus really did predict their suffering, then it's not hard to believe that the apostles knew what they were getting into, and they went ahead anyway. This is also backed up by the letters to the early churches, which consistently describe a reality of suffering and opposition. Paul, writing to the Thessalonians, links their suffering to what was happening in Judea, where the apostles originated. He says, "You became imitators of the churches in Judea. You suffered the same things from your own people as they did from the Judeans." Paul, writing to the Corinthians, also states that all the apostles were suffering. God has put his apostles on display, like those condemned to die in the arena. We have been made a spectacle. We go hungry and thirsty. We are in rags. We are brutally treated. We are homeless. We have become the scum of the earth. This isn't just Christians in general. Paul specifically names the apostles. If Peter, James, and John had bailed, the Corinthians definitely would have noticed, and Paul's words wouldn't make any sense. This same message of suffering runs through the letters to different regions by different authors. James 5:10-11 talks about how the prophets have suffered, and so do we. Philippians 1:28-29 talks about suffering for Christ is part of the deal. 1 Peter 4:12-13 talks about how trials are expected and not strange. And Hebrews 10:32-34 talks about how the early believers endured public shame, imprisonment, and loss of property because they were convinced of their eternal reward. Many of these churches likely knew the apostles. Corinth was familiar with Peter and Jesus' brothers, and Galatia knew Peter, James, and John. The recipients of James and Peter's letters would have known who they were, regardless of any authorship debates. If the apostles had been avoiding persecution, You'd think somebody would have noticed. And the early church had no problem exposing defectors. They called out Judas as a traitor, Demas for loving this present world, John Mark for bailing out on a mission, and even Peter when he caved under pressure. If the apostles had chickened out, we would definitely know. Finally, let's look at the earliest Christian writers, those within living memory of the apostles. Writing to the Corinthians, again a church that knew Peter and Paul personally, Clement states, "Through zeal and envy, the most faithful and righteous pillars of the church have been persecuted, even to the most grievous deaths. Peter endured many sufferings before his martyrdom. Paul in like manner received the reward of his patience." Clement is reminding his audience of what they already knew about Peter and Paul. A disciple of John, Polycarp, writes, "I exhort you all to exercise patience, as you have seen set forth before your eyes, in Paul himself and the rest of the apostles. They suffered and have gone to be with the Lord." He doesn't just say some of the apostles suffered, he said all of them did, and he was in a place to know. Another early church leader, Ignatius, writes, "Having felt and handled Christ's body at his resurrection, and being convinced both by his flesh and spirit, they, the apostles, despised death, and were found to be above it." Like Clement and Polycarp, Ignatius confirms that the apostles weren't just preaching, they were willing to suffer and die for their message. No, we don't have perfect death records for every apostle, but we do have more than enough to go on. All the available evidence we have tells us that they faced danger and persecution and didn't back down. Their willingness to suffer speaks volumes about their sincerity, so Alex is just wrong.